Joining me now is our BC Bureau Chief, our friend, intrepid reporter Drea Humphrey. And I wanted to have Drea on the show for a couple of different reasons. There are some very interesting things happening in politics in British Columbia. They have a movement towards the right, towards smaller government and personal and fiscal responsibility there. And it was also Drea's first annual general meeting of a political party. And so I'm curious about what that experience was like for her. And I want to talk about the issues that were brought forward at the BC Conservatives' first AGM post very nearly forming government in British Columbia, which, like, even 2 years ago would have been just a Sheila Gunn Reid pipe dream. So, Drea, thanks for coming on the show. I want to ask you first, like, what were you expecting? Did you have expectations? Because you don't have any experience in this whatsoever.
That's right. 2020 was when I became more political for reasons I think most people know. And this was my first AGM. I tried to put my expectations aside because I didn't really have any. I just went in there as a journalist and I spoke to many of the members, I would say well over 100, to get their feedback. I asked everyone I could, had you been to an AGM before? And if so, what did you think of this one? One thing that stood out to me going into the AGM was, in fact, its location being in Nanaimo, which is an NDP stronghold. So it was kind of like, I wonder why it's here. But other than that, it was just nice to be the eyes and ears for people while I was there.
Yeah, it is on the surface, I think it's strange that it is in Nanaimo. But at the same time, on the island, the BC Conservatives have really made some inroads over the past little bit. Like, we know the interior of BC is very Albertan in its voting habits, both federally and provincially. But the island, it's a weird mix of people. There are some conservatives there, but there are a lot of people who don't maybe know that they've quite been left behind by the left yet. These are the conventional hippies of yore. They're skeptics of big pharma. They don't like being told how to live their lives. They want to be left alone by the government. And during COVID, the left, the NDP and the Greens, they were really in lockstep with big pharma and government overreach. And so those people, those are baby conservatives. They just need to be spoken to the right way.
Absolutely. There's also a sector of the left that has come over, calling themselves refugees because they know what a woman is and they used to stand for women's rights and they don't like what's happening in that area too. So you're right. There's definitely some room to grow in that area. And boy, did it grow. That also stood out to me. There was about approximately 800 members in attendance, and I'm told 600 delegates voted around that number there. So that is a huge difference from the previous AGM for the Conservative Party, which I'm told from everybody who I spoke to in attendance was around 150 people. So massive growth there, lots of energy. And I don't think it's been a dull moment at all in BC politics for a couple of years now, ever since the Conservative Party, which was once totally underestimated, was going on their rise. It continues to be sort of a spicy thing. And so there was some spicy moments during the AGM as well that I could talk about here, but also I talk about in my recap video, which is coming up.
And I think it's important to note that the BC Conservatives AGM, it's happening where it did happen like within days of the BC budget being announced.
Yes. Yeah.
And I think that's really important because they passed a resolution that says that the government, if the BC Conservatives form government, that they would return to a balanced budget situation as soon as possible, which is definitely not what the BC NDP think. They are just tax and spend, just taxing you more, but also using that as an excuse to spend more. So that is a cultural sea change in BC, I think.
And how convenient they get to use the tariffs as an excuse for our record-breaking 10.6 deficit, which was just proposed by the NDP government.
Okay, so you just mentioned some of the spicy issues. So tell me some of the spicy, if you want to talk about issues, debates, policy proposals, tell me about some of those, because I'm fresh out of the Alberta one just a few short months ago, and it was really around those things that are deep in the culture war. We know what conservatives think about financial stuff, but do they stand for the appropriate definition of what a woman is? Will they
Hmm.
defend women in sports, kids at school from cultural indoctrination? That was and in Alberta, it's always Alberta firearms rights is a big thing too, that which
Yeah.
differentiates us from the people on the left. Do we care about free speech and freedom of the press? Tell me about the BC conservatives, because as you said, for a lot of people, this is the first time they're getting to know what a BC conservative is.
Yeah, well, absolutely. Like I said, there was around 800 people, and I don't want to be like the legacy media, which only talked about dissent, because that certainly wasn't the
Mhm.
case. The vast majority of people I spoke to were, in fact, happy with the AGM, happy with the way the party's going, and excited to see where the future was going. As far as the dissenters go, I think overall they maybe labeled themselves the grassroots, although you could hear it on both sides. One of the concerns was just, the fact that almost last minute it went from a 2-day AGM to a 1-day AGM. People felt like, hey, we booked our stuff. What's going on here? And how are we going to, talk about all the issues at hand, the policy changes, the recommendations to change, amend the Constitution? That was another big concern, was people felt like those proposed amendments to the Constitution, that they didn't even have enough time to go over and understand them. So there was complaints about that. There were people who were claiming that their riding associations had not been supported, or in some ways they felt almost had been blocked, where they say that they didn't get any delegates in their riding, and they weren't quite sure why that happened. And so, they started coming up with their own reasons as to why that happens. Now, I will tell you, I am investigating a lot of these claims and will have a follow-up report in addition to the report that's coming out with my recap. One thing I notice is that on all sides, there is this, it seems like a mutual respect for John Rusted, whether or not they feel like the board needed to change, or in particular, some did not like how John Rusted put forth a slate that he wanted to
Mm.
be voted for the board, for example. And by the way, that's exactly what happened. Everyone that he wanted is who got voted. Some thought that was unfair. But even the ones who were disgruntled at large, they seem to really like John Rusted as a leader. And I get to see a little bit of perhaps why that is in action at the AGM. For example, the people who wanted to be aboard, they had prepared 2 to 3 minute speeches and were supposed to go ahead, but perhaps because it all got condensed last minute into that one day, they were told, no, you're not going to do your speeches. And then they were told, okay, you can do your speeches in the other room and we'll announce, so that people could leave the main room and go listen. And they did announce that. But, I don't think a lot of people wanted to leave the main room. Like, it was a little weird. And so I'm told that they went to John and said, we're not happy about this. And he intervened. He's not able to manage everything that's going on in AGM, but he did step in and say, no, get them on the stage. So that was something I heard. People were really happy that he listened to them, and then everybody got to hear them, put their speech forward. Another thing is, there was concerns, again, like I said, about the amount of time, how soon they want to do these amendments to the Constitution. And one of them was the omnibus, that would say that the board that does get in is sitting for a 4-year term. So some people had issues with that. And John Rusted took the stage and said, you know what, I've heard enough of you guys. Like, we can't be doing this every year. We certainly won't be able to do that, but I've heard you. We're going to change that to 2 years instead of 4. And then there was lots of claps about that. And then that passed. So it did seem to, people are trying to manage things and run things. And it did seem like when it came to Mr. Rusted himself, he was listening to the people and making some changes. So that was really interesting to see as well. As far as some of, my personal favorites, considering what I cover, we did see former Chilliwack School trustee Heather Moss, who is now an MLA for Chilliwack North, put forth, let's get rid of SOGI completely from schools to solidify where they stand. And so, of course, that passed with flying colors out there. So when you ask about, are they going to stand for parental rights, it looks like they're still continuing on that path. The question about males and women's sports, we know that party put forth a bill already proposing for safety and fairness in women's sports, and it got shut down even before,
Right.
the first, is it reading or what have you, by the NDP. But to put it in perspective about where they're going, they actually had safe and same-sex space advocate Amy Ham do a speech, and
Nice.
that was a great speech. A speech that talked about the horrible things that have been happening to British Columbia. I've covered all of the ones that she mentioned. Just one example is the little, I think she was 8-year-old, and there was a man with a wig and a face mask who started peeping under the stalls in Nanaimo, in that very city where the
Mhm.
AGM was, and looking under the stalls. And of course, when mom goes to complain, she's told, no, it's his right to, or her, probably her right to be there. And if you don't stop, making a scene, we're going to call the cops. So that was one of the examples. So Amy Ham went through these horrific scenarios and tied them into British Columbia. And at the end of that, she actually called out the CBC reporter in the room and said shame on the CBC for their coverage. And so that received a standing ovation. So I think that puts into perspective where the party stands on that issue as well.
Well, and I think any party that is growing as fast as the BC Conservatives have, I mean, really, 2 years ago, they didn't really exist in any
Yeah.
sort of respectable form. And somehow they very nearly formed government. We'll talk about the issues around that in a second. They're going to experience growing pains. You've got a lot
Mm-hmm.
of new people into the party who this is their first time engaging in the political party process. They may be voters, they may be, you know, activists in their community, but to actually get involved in the machinery of politics,
Yeah.
there's a lot of rules and stuff happening in the background that as somebody on the outside looking in, you had no idea. And I'm sure you experienced that firsthand. You're probably like, God, there's a lot of
Yeah.
stuff
Yeah.
going on here.